The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
Thank you for joining us this evening to discuss the expanding role of China throughout the African continent. We're pleased to have Deborah Brautigam here to lend her expertise on the current situation and look forward to hearing her assessments of the risks and opportunities on this controversial subject. Deborah Brautigam is Associate Professor in the School of International Service at America University, concentrating on development policy, governance, and democracy. She has been a faculty member at Columbia University in New York, at Silpakorn University in Thailand, and was also a visiting fellow at the University of Liberia in Monrovia, the University of Mauritius, and the Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone. Brautigam's research focuses on foreign aid, the political economy of development, and the politics of economic policy. She has served as a consultant for the United Nations, the World Bank, and the U.S. Agency for International Development in Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and various sub-Saharan African countries. She is the author of Chinese Aid and African Development, Exporting Green Revolution, and Aid, Dependence, and Governance. Her latest book, The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa, will be available for purchase and signing after the program. Brautigam earned her BA from Ohio Wesleyan University and her MALD and PhD from Tufts University. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Brautigam to World Behind the Headlines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for bringing me out to Chicago. Beautiful campus that you have here, and I'm glad to be so close to my home state of Wisconsin, which is a little bit further north and a little bit colder than here. So it's also very nice to be in a room where people can't find seats, so I appreciate that as a speaker. So thanks a lot for coming. I want to start out with a story, and the story starts once upon a time. So once upon a time, there was a large, very poor, but resource-rich country, just emerging from a period of intense conflict. And they decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure, they said. We need to build railways. We need to import new technologies. We need to develop our mines. Soon they had a visit from a large, wealthy Asian country that had already become a major consumer of their oil. And this Asian country offered them a bargain. We will give you a line of credit worth $10 billion. And you can use this line of credit to import technologies from us. You can pay our companies to develop your mines with high technologies that you don't have, or develop your ports. And you can repay us with your oil. Many in this poor country were intensely suspicious of this large Asian country. But they agreed to the bargain, and the work began. So, which two countries do you think I'm talking about? Okay, I'm hearing lots of different possibilities there, but clearly one of the countries was China. China was the large, poor country with oil. And the other country was Japan. And the time was 30 years ago, when China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. And when Deng Xiaoping first proposed this in China in 1975, mid-70s, it was intensely controversial. Japan is not a traditional friend of China. Foreign technologies were something the PRC felt that it could do without, or many people thought they could. So it was very controversial. But nevertheless, they did this. And China went on to prosper. And this relationship helped in the beginning. And I think it still does. So there are several points here that relate to China's engagement in Africa. And the first is that this was not altruism on Japan's part. This was not foreign aid. The $10 billion was not concessional. Later on, there were concessional loans, but the first one was not. But most importantly, and second, is that China's leaders saw this as an opportunity. They saw that they could use their natural resources as a foundation for their own development. They could do a bargain. Our resources for your technology and your advanced construction services and skills. And Japan was pleased to get access to China's oil and coal and sell them advanced technology. So the rest is history, as they say. So I hope you were surprised by this story, and from the guesses that were going about which countries it was, I imagine that you were. It's one of many surprises I think you'll find in this book. China is offering the same bargain to many African countries today. It's a very clear-eyed bargain. It's not altruism. It's not foreign aid. Leverage what you have and what we want. Leverage oil if you're Congo-Brazzaville. Leverage cocoa if you're Ghana. Leverage sesame if you're Ethiopia. Leverage these resources to build the telecoms projects, the power plants, the railways that you believe to be necessary for your country's development. On hearing of one major deal along these lines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an editor at Financial Times said, Beijing has thrown down the most direct challenge yet to the West's architecture for aiding African development. And I think he was right. The book that I'm talking about today is about Chinese aid and state-sponsored economic engagement in Africa. These two things get mixed up so much. And so I spend some time in the book pulling them apart, separating them out, and then showing how they sometimes come back together again. And at the beginning, I had a more academic title. I'm a professor after all, and I'm used to giving academic titles to my books. I was going to call it Chinese Strategic Engagement in Africa. And my editor at Oxford had already decided this would be what they call a crossover book, that an academic book that goes into a larger audience. And while I was off doing field work in Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Zambia, and I wasn't on the internet, she put the proposal forward to the board with a different title. And she was calling it Rogue Donor with a question mark, the real story of China and Africa. And when I heard about this, I said, whoa, we can't use that title. And then I looked at my contract and I saw that Oxford has the last word on the title. It's something you don't necessarily know, but they have the last word on the title, the book cover, all of those things. So we did negotiate on it, and I got the title changed to something else that was still catchy but not so alarming, and she got to keep the subtitle. So that's why we have that. But then the book was released in November in the UK, and my editor was very annoyed because she said to me, look, a week ago, Sarah Palin's memoir was released, Going Rogue. And if we had called your book Rogue Donor, Going Rogue, we could have had some tie-in promotions. She said we lost a great opportunity. But seriously, I wrote this book out of a mixture of alarm and scholarly curiosity. And the alarm comes from what I saw being portrayed in the media. And this was on both sides. In the Chinese media, the move into Africa is presented in wholly positive terms. China is a sincere friend. China is helping its African brothers. China is a good partner. The Tanzam Railway, the famous railway built during the 1970s in Tanzania and Zambia to enable Zambia to export its copper without having to go through apartheid South Africa, is regularly trotted out in the Chinese press as an example of China's sincere intentions of brotherhood toward the continent. And there's very rarely a mention of all of the problems of Chinese companies getting down and dirty in the mud, along with companies from all over the world in Africa's very problematic environment, all the kickbacks, the labor problems, the environmental problems, etc. You don't read about those. On the other hand, in the West, that's all you read about. You read about that China is the new colonialist in Africa. You read that Chinese aid is toxic, that they're making poverty worse. that China gives billions in aid to prop up Sudan and Zimbabwe and pariah regimes, that China is leading the charge to grab huge swaths of land across Africa, that they bring in all their own labor and they don't hire Africans. And much of this is, in fact, not true. So, I first went to China 30 years ago as a language student, and then I went to Africa to do my first book, which was on Chinese aid in Africa. So I do cross over these two big regions. And I know from all this experience it's not easy to do this kind of research. It involves a lot of interviews, a lot of archival work, a lot of intense consideration of documents, both on the internet and not, and multiple trips, both to China and to many countries in Africa. And for the research, I went to some of the more difficult places. I went to Zimbabwe. I went to Nigeria. I'll tell you some of those stories. And I also went to some of the easier places, Mauritius, and Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa, Sierra Leone. And in earlier research on this, I had gone to Liberia and the Gambia. And after the book was finished, I went to Egypt. So there are a lot of different countries represented in the book in particular. And when I was writing this book, I sometimes felt like Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese film director of the famous film Rashomon. And this is a film that many of you, I hope, have seen. You know, you're here at the University of Chicago, and this is an area of high culture. If you haven't seen it, you really have to. It's a film in which an event takes place in the woods. And you see it first, and you think you know what happened. And then you see it from another perspective, and it looks entirely different. And a third perspective, and it looks different yet again. And so that's why I felt a little bit like Akira Kurosawa. Not that I'm a great film director, but I was trying to portray the conventional wisdom from another perspective and another perspective. And I do this throughout the book. I present what we think we know, and then I show another picture, and maybe a third picture. And so I construct much of the conventional wisdom. I only have time tonight for a few of these myths and realities, and so I'm going to talk to you about 3 or possibly 4. And the first one is that China is a new donor in Africa. Now, everyone in this room is probably aware that that's not the case. China's been there for 50 years or longer, and they've been giving aid for 50 years. But why does this matter? It matters because the Chinese have learned from their experience. They had a lot of failures with their aid projects. And when you look at the Chinese documents, the Chinese writing on this, they're always trying to figure out how can we do this differently? How can we do this better? Because we're not doing a very good job. And so a lot of what they're doing today comes out of that examination of what they had done in the past. And they've come up with a different model of engagement, one that doesn't actually involve much foreign aid. It's much more about business. It's about creating incentives for Chinese companies to work together with Africans on some of the things that African governments want to do. We'll return to this. But China's long history also gives them a lot of credibility. I often hear that China came, amongst people who know that China was in Africa a while ago, they say, okay, China came, they built the Tanzam Railway, a few stadiums, and then they left. And they only came back when their hunger for oil increased. But that's not actually the case, because I was there in the 80s and 90s doing research on this, and I saw there were Chinese doing projects in the various countries where I was. And they were very quiet, they were out of the way, they didn't have billboards up to announce where they were. That's changing. They're definitely putting the billboards up now. And there's a whole discussion in the Ministry of Commerce about just how to promote their aid through these billboards. They even had a tender about how to have logos for the aid program, which is so new and different for them. But we weren't looking. Most of us weren't looking. And they scaled back in the 80s and 90s as they focused on their development at home, but they remained. And this gives them not only credibility, but experience. And so the first 3 chapters of the book focus on the history, how this relationship built up, how it changed, and how the Chinese experimented, how they were crossing the river by feeling the stones, as Chen Yun said, which Deng Xiaoping later picked up on. We all think that Deng Xiaoping was the originator of that. But they are also, as Bo Xilai, who is the former Minister of Commerce, said, they're crossing the ocean by feeling the stones. So these are experimental things that they're still doing in Africa today. So, myth number 2. Chinese aid is huge. That's a myth. Chinese economic engagement is pretty large, and I'll give you some of the dimensions of that. But the aid is not that big. And it's probably the single most repeated error on this. I'll just give you 2 examples out of many that I document in the book. A World Bank study on China's infrastructure involvement in Africa, which is a good study. But they picked up on one report that was in Dow Jones Newswire that Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao had said that China had given $44 billion in aid to Africa since 1960. And when I saw that, I thought, this is way, way more than it should be, and I wonder what the real figure is. So I looked around, and I found a Chinese report of the same visit that Wen Jiabao had been on when he made that statement. He was in North Africa. And that source said it was 44 billion renminbi in the Chinese currency, which is about $5.6 billion. It's a very different order of magnitude. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor. And there are other examples. For example, the New York Times, I think it was 2007, they had an op-ed in which they reported that China was thought to have given $9 billion to just one project in Nigeria. And when I looked into this, I found out that although there was a $500 million preferential export credit on the table that might have been applied to this, there wasn't actually any Chinese financing attached to that project at all at the time that they were writing. And so there was nothing like a $9 billion aid project going on there. So Chinese trade is huge. If you look at the graphs on trade, it goes like up like that. It's an enormous increase. In the year 2000, Chinese trade to the continent of Africa was $10 billion, imports, exports combined. And in 2008, that had gone up to $106 billion. So you can see, huge increase. A lot of that in 2008 was due to the high price of oil and other minerals that year. Chinese investment is also large, but far smaller than the West's investment in Africa. And the figures that we have for investment are not so good from China. According to the figures that they have, it's $7.8 billion accumulated, stocks of investment. But each year, it's usually under $1 billion. So these are not very large figures. China's official development assistance each year is about, according to my figures, which are in Chapter 6 of the book, it's about an average of $1.9 billion over the last 3 years. That's an average, and it's probably been going up, so lower to higher, but overall, $1.9 billion. And this is far lower than from the West. The United States, for example, official development assistance to Africa in 2007 was over $7 billion. And these both figures all include debt relief. So China's smaller than most of the major donors, Germany and a number of others there. But Chinese companies are getting a huge number of contracts. And I'll talk about that in just a minute because I'm going to go into the third myth. The third myth is that Chinese aid and state-sponsored economic engagement in Africa is solely about oil and natural resources. Now, that's a myth I hear over and over again, that Chinese aid is out there in order to enable China to get more resources. In the huge picture, I don't think you can even say that. Surely, China is very, very interested in oil and resources in Africa, just as Japan was interested in oil and coal in China. But Japan had a lot of other interests as well, and so does China. And we can see this when we look at the data. Trade, for example. The United States trade with Africa in 2008 was about $120 billion with the continent. And of that, about $100 billion was exports from Africa to the United States, and most of that was oil. And we exported only about $20 billion to Africa. Now, with the Chinese, it's almost half and half. So it's about $53 billion or so, around that, for African exports to China, and around the same figure for Chinese exports to Africa. So Chinese trade in Africa as a market is hugely important for them. So that's one thing that's very clear from the data. And the second thing that's clear from the data is that Chinese aid, we don't have good figures on it, but we have an idea because we know which countries get aid, and we have a rough idea of how much they get. it's spread across the continent. So every single country in Africa, with the exception of Swaziland, has received aid from China, not just the resource-rich countries. And that is because aid is mainly given for political reasons. And it's given to countries that recognize Beijing instead of Taipei as the rightful China. And so it's countries that have diplomatic relations. Now, in the West, we tend to have donor favorites. The Francophone countries tend to get their aid from France. The Anglophone countries tend to get their aid from the United Kingdom. And the United States, of course, our biggest aid recipient in Africa is Egypt. And this is for political reasons as well, because of our concern about the Middle East and Israel. So with China, it's much more even, and that's because of the political rationale for aid. Now, you might ask, what about these very large loans that we read about? $4.5 billion and above for Angola, up to $9 billion for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These are very large packages that have been talked about in the press, and these are very real. Isn't this aid? It's often described that way. But in fact, these are loans that are on commercial rates, so these are business transactions. And many of the reporters who were writing about these loans didn't understand some of the basic financial terms. Now, when I tell you that the $4.5 billion to Angola was given LIBOR plus 150 basis points, would you understand what I'm talking about? LIBOR plus 150 basis points. So that's the terms of the loan. And let me explain what that means. LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate. It's a basic financial rate that banks use to give loans to each other. And it's also used as a basis for a variable rate loan. So the loan that may change every 3 months or every 6 months or every year, the interest rate will be adjusted, a variable rate loan. And so if your loan is given at LIBOR, that's not foreign aid, because banks don't give foreign aid to each other. They give loans at commercial rates. And LIBOR plus 100 basis points is LIBOR plus 1% or 1.5%. And that's standard way in which these loans are structured. And it's very similar to the loans structured by Standard Chartered Bank, for example, in Angola, which were LIBOR plus 2.5%. The Chinese were LIBOR plus 1.5%. So this wasn't foreign aid. And the Chinese never describe it as foreign aid. So finally, oil and minerals are a huge part of Chinese interest in Africa. And their companies are going into investments in these areas in a big way, and they're trying to expand as much as they can in ways that make economic sense. But the data that we have on infrastructure contracts that are signed by Chinese companies, for Chinese companies to do this infrastructure work that I've been talking about, are far larger than any of the investment figures that we have. For example, the Ministry of Commerce last year, in 2008, which is more than last year, but their figures, which have just been released, for the contracts signed by Chinese infrastructure companies in Africa is $40 billion just in 1 year. And the revenues earned by Chinese companies in 2008 were reported at $20 billion just for 1 year. And so these are very large figures. And it shows that this interest in doing infrastructure, and these infrastructure contracts are not, most of these are not financed by the Chinese. They're financed by African governments that have resources. They're financed by the World Bank. Chinese companies are winning a large number of World Bank projects. They're financed by the African Development Bank. More than half of all the contracts issued for infrastructure by that bank are won by Chinese companies in Africa. And private firms in Africa that hire Chinese construction companies to build buildings and do work for them. And then one last piece of evidence on this is that China's single largest investment in Africa, does anyone know what it is? The one completed, signed deal that's actually happened. There's one largest one. Now you're all going to hesitate to guess because I tricked you last time with the Japan story. It's 20% of Standard Bank in South Africa. So that was $5 billion. That's the single largest one investment that's been signed, sealed, and delivered. And this shows up in the FDI data. So a Nigerian official said to me, and I interviewed him actually in Beijing, he said to me, the West comes to Nigeria, and it's oil, oil, oil. But China comes here, and they're interested in everything. So what kind of impact is Chinese engagement having in Africa? I address 3 areas in the book. And I have to say that to know about impact is very difficult to do at this point. We don't have a lot of data. We don't have big data sets where we can do econometric analysis on aid or these flows from Chinese banks because we don't have the figures. And so much of this engagement is so recent that we haven't been able to see it play out. For example, many things were announced, many Chinese projects, initiatives, experiments at the end of November in 2006. And those are just now not even complete. They're still underway, so we haven't seen the results of those. For example, the Chinese promised to do 7 special economic zones. They call them economic trade and economic cooperation zones across Africa. And these 7 have been decided upon, but none of them has opened up yet. So we haven't actually seen what will happen with that. So I look at 3 areas. I look at manufacturing, agriculture, and governance. And I have 2 chapters on agriculture and 2 on manufacturing, and then governance comes in at several points in the book, mostly in chapter 11. But in agriculture, I was particularly interested in this question because my first book had been on Chinese aid in agriculture. And so I had read, as many of you probably have, about big Chinese land deals. And I just last week looked at the CBS News website, and they have a new story out by somebody, Robert O'Brien or somebody like that. And he reports that China has grabbed half of the arable land in the DRC. Well, this kind of story gets repeated often. And so, to my surprise, in looking at each of the land deals that was reported in the press, they were all different, or they were either different or they didn't exist. For example, there is a deal in the DRC. And the deal in the DRC is a curious one. It involves a Chinese telecommunications company called ZTE. And they have a concession for 100,000 hectares in the DRC to grow oil palm for fuel oil. That exists. You can find it on the website of the parliament because the project was approved by the parliament in the DRC. It's also on the Chinese embassy website in the DRC. So it's a large project, but it was reported in the press as 3 million hectares. So these are very different figures. It's a lot smaller than it actually was reported to be. And nothing has happened on that project yet. So I don't know if they will go forward. I was prepared to believe that there were a lot of projects like this across Africa because, in fact, Chinese companies are doing projects like this in Southeast Asia. We know of land deals in the Philippines, very large ones. That one was ultimately thrown out. We know of land deals in Papua New Guinea and in Indonesia, and there's one also in Laos. So these are ones that are true, and we have evidence for it. But in Africa, I went to Mozambique, Zambia. I did research on Senegal, though I didn't go there. And I went to Zimbabwe, and these are all places where I'd heard about these large land deals, and they didn't exist in any of these places. And I was really surprised to see that because, if you look on the internet or Google this, you find lots and lots of what looks like evidence. But when you're on the ground, the evidence isn't there. Now, this could change. The land-labor ratios in China and in Africa lead many Chinese to think that, as I quote one person I interviewed in Sierra Leone, he looked at me and he looked around, he said, land is everywhere here and nobody's using it. And so there's this perception that land is relatively unused in Africa. As I point out in the book, that's an erroneous perception on the part of many Chinese because they use land so intensely. But in many parts of Africa, land is used on a shifting cultivation basis. So they have to have a lot of fallow periods and long areas, big areas for that. But Chinese investors who have gone to Africa have come back, and as one Chinese article on this reported, investment in agriculture is not a good chew on the bones. And I wasn't sure what a good chew on the bones is, but it sounds like juicy and favorable. They don't think it's a very good thing to do. So what about manufacturing? Now, what we hear about is that Chinese imports of low-level goods, cheap goods, into Africa, particularly textiles, have wiped out the manufacturing sector in Africa. There is a lot of evidence that this is, in fact, true with regard to textiles. The textile industries have been suffering for a long time in Africa. They've not gone through upgrading. They're using outmoded machinery. They're not competitive. And Chinese textiles have been smuggled in. They're using counterfeits of African textiles, the lapas and the other prints. So there's a lot of evidence that supports this interpretation. But there's another story too, and that is that several of the African countries that were exporting textiles have been competitive still with China, even after the end of the trade agreement called the Multi-Fiber Arrangement, the MFA, that ended in 2005. They still remained competitive. And we can see, I show the data on this in the book. And there are other examples of this too. So in a selection of about half the countries in Africa, for the past 5 years, manufacturing growth rates have been going up. And others, they've been going down. But the story is not the same across the continent. And that also reflects that Africa is not just one place. It's many different places, many different kinds of governments, and many different kinds of sets of investors there. So Chinese competition was supposed to be wiping this out across the continent. And this is an uneven story. Now, some of this new growth in manufacturing is due to Chinese investment. And the single largest growing sector for Chinese exports to Africa is equipment and machinery. A lot of this is construction equipment for all of those projects, but some of it is equipment and machinery for factories. And some of it is factories that are being set up in these 7 overseas special economic zones that are going up around Africa. Now, these are being set up by an interesting model that shows what the Chinese learned about mixing aid and business incentives. It's not that the Chinese government is saying, you know, the command economy, we're going to build these things and we just go and set them up. It's not working like that. What they did is they've decided to build actually a lot of these around the world. The hope is to do eventually 50 of these overseas zones. And 19 of them have been contracted out so far to Chinese companies. And the process is this. In Beijing in 2006 and 2007, the Ministry of Commerce announced a tender to have Chinese companies bid on these zones. And so Chinese companies, 110, made proposals. And their proposals went to Beijing. A smaller number were selected. And they went before a panel of Chinese professors and Chinese experts who had come from some of China's own special economic zones, including Shenzhen, the famous one on the border with Hong Kong. And they selected these 19 proposals to get financial assistance from Beijing. So they're getting help to set up these zones. But the zones are supposed to be profitable for the companies to run. And in Africa, there are 7 of these. Now, give Chinese companies incentives to invest in something that African governments want, and people. They want zones that will set up manufacturing. They want transfer of technology. They want employment. And the zones that I've looked at, and with a Chinese colleague, we've done research now on all of these zones. And there's no requirement that they bring in Chinese labor. There's no requirement that only Chinese companies invest in these zones. So these are wide open with various kinds of restrictions for investment. And in November last year at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Egypt, the Chinese announced that they were setting up a $1 billion fund for African small and medium enterprises so that they could invest more easily in these zones. And then there are private African entrepreneurs who are engaging with Chinese partners. In Nigeria, I visited Innocent Chukwuma. He's this swashbuckling, he was described in one newspaper report before I went there as this swashbuckling entrepreneur. He's not so swashbuckling when you actually meet him. But I visited him at his factories in Enugu, and then he sent me down to some of his other factories in a town called Newi, where I've been doing research, first for the World Bank in 1991, and I've been back there. It's my 4th visit to Newi. It's in what used to be called Biafra in eastern Nigeria. And it's not very far from the Niger Delta, and it's actually not a very safe area. And he had 2 Chinese engineers that were working for him and setting up one of his factories kidnapped by armed robbers who held them for ransom, and only one of them was ever returned. And so when I went down, he supplied a car for me very kindly. And he supplied 2 policemen with AK-47s, so one on each side of the car as we drove down to Niue. And this was for armed robbers who tend to stop cars. They put glass in the highway, and then the cars, the wheels blow out, and they stop them and rob them. And then when I was in Niue, it was difficult to go around. I went around to all of the factories, but it was hard to even, at one point, there was a meeting going on, so I went out in the street to see if I could find some ground nuts because I was getting hungry. And people were just absolutely panicked because I had walked out in the street and they thought, that someone might come and kidnap me and hold me for ransom. So I told my husband about this when I got back. He said, "I'm glad you waited till you got back to tell me these stories." But I asked him, as we walked around this huge plastics factory that he had set up in Enugu, more than 1,000 Nigerian workers were in there and 3 Chinese technical people that had come, engineers that were working with him. And I asked him how could he compete with Chinese imports, because I had read that Chinese imports were wiping out the plastics industry in Nigeria. And he said to me, I have a joint venture factory actually in China that produces tires. So I know what Chinese workers are making. They're making the same as my workers here. I pay the workers the same. So that's the same. He said, I'm using Chinese equipment and factory. The machinery is all new. It comes from China. It's the same machinery they're using. And I get my raw materials here in Nigeria because it's oil. That's what you make plastics out of. And I have a distribution system all around Nigeria and the neighboring countries. So I'm exporting. I'm servicing markets across the country. He said, why wouldn't I be competitive? It's not that hard. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. We don't have that many more examples. I did speak to other people in that area of Nigeria who were partnering with Chinese joint venture partners. And these were all private sector kinds of things, no government involvement. But it, at the very least, it sheds some light on the possibilities for the future. And these are things that are still unraveling. Many of the factories I looked at were being constructed now, so they hadn't even gone into production yet. And others were up and running. Finally, there's governance. And many argue that with China rising and accelerating its involvement in Africa, that progress in human rights and democracy and good governance in Africa will be reversed. But I predict that the impact of Chinese engagement is likely to be more marginal than most people believe. And why do I say that? For 3 reasons. First of all, there's no evidence that China is particularly more comfortable with authoritarian or repressive governments or seeks them out. Their engagement across Africa is spread across all of the places where they think they can make money. And this is in some of Africa's best governed countries. South Africa, Mauritius, Botswana are all big sites for Chinese interest. Financing of infrastructure, investment in the case of Mauritius, and South Africa surely. And so they're also interested in badly governed countries. They're making money in those as well. And I'll get back to that. Which is the second point, that China is not static. They've really learned a lot. After the blowback on the Darfur issue in Sudan, this tragic rebellion that continues to unfold in Sudan, and in Zimbabwe's wretched government of Robert Mugabe, they've got blowback on both of these issues, and they changed. And you can see this quite clearly. In the case of Sudan, the Chinese role has changed a lot. Part of this was due to all of the advocacy around the Olympics. I think that played a really constructive role, although the Chinese are not happy with it at all. But it got them moving, and it got them to reconsider what non-interference in internal affairs might actually mean. And so we can see the Chinese pushing Khartoum to accept the joint UN African Union peacekeeping force that finally they agreed to establish in Darfur. And you have President Bush's special envoy for Darfur, Andrew Natsios, and President Obama's special envoy for Darfur, Scott Gratian, both saying that China's now part of the solution and applauding them for their ability to get Khartoum to come to the peacemaking table. And I was really surprised when I was in Egypt. I spoke to a lot of Africans there because most countries in Africa sent delegations to the Chinese the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in November last year. And several people said to me, why didn't the Chinese support the African Union on the International Criminal Court case against Bashir? And what had happened was that the Chinese could have, the Security Council at the UN had to allow this case to go to the International Criminal Court. And the Chinese could have vetoed that, and they didn't. And so these people were saying the African Union position on this was that we do not want Bashir to go to the International Criminal Court. And the Chinese should have supported us, but they didn't. And so I think this is another example of how the position is a lot more nuanced than is presented usually. And in my research in Zimbabwe, I found that the Chinese were deeply frustrated with Mugabe and the failure of their economic engagement there. And according to all independent sources, they had actually put very little money into the country. The economic office in Zimbabwe at the Chinese embassy spent a lot of time running to the Zimbabwe Ministry of Finance. They were trying to drum up payments for contracted work that Chinese companies had done 5, 6, 7 years ago and hadn't yet been repaid. And if you look at the Sinosure website, which is the export credit insurance company in Beijing, Zimbabwe, the bad loans to Zimbabwe are one of their chunks in their annual report that they have to say we're now paying for these bad loans that the Zimbabweans are not repaying. One Chinese company had tried for 6 years to finalize a contract at the Huanghe to do a power plant at the Huanghe coal area. And last week, Zimbabwe's Minister of Finance, Tendai Biti, was in Washington. He's a member of the opposition, the MDC. And I asked him about Chinese support for Mugabe. And he said, before and after the inclusive government, Chinese economic engagement was very minimal. He also commented that press reports of huge new Chinese deals in Zimbabwe were all fiction. And it seems to me that Mugabe is a bit like the Wizard of Oz. You know, he's behind this curtain and he's saying great and powerful, and I have spoken and I'm looking east, and I've got this extensive support from Beijing. But in reality, if you pull the curtain aside, you see he doesn't have this support. So on governance issues, I think it's very clear that Chinese companies are prone to give kickbacks. They don't have a good reputation as far as corruption goes. And in authoritarian, resource-rich countries like Chad or Congo-Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea, where many Western companies are also operating, they're going to do all the same things that Western companies have been documented for doing, all the things that were the reason why we have things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the Publish What You Pay campaign, and other things to try to get Western companies to become more transparent, and which they've been resisting as well. They're going to disrespect the environment. And their labor standards and safety standards on their investments are going to be far worse than those that we find from companies from the West. But they actually employ a lot more locals than most people believe, and in bad conditions, which most people also believe. And I agree with that. But my third point on governance is that the large Chinese loans that I've been telling you about are less likely to be embezzled than loans that come from Western banks, or even than the policy loans from the World Bank or the Structural Adjustment or the ESAF funds they're called now from the IMF. Now, why do I say that? I say that because these resource-backed infrastructure loans that I started out telling you about, while not foreign aid, they actually provide an agency of restraint. They work like this. They're backed by the resource, and the funds from the resource go into an escrow account, and then they repay the infrastructure investments that happen first. So the infrastructure gets built. Say $2 billion worth was the initial tranche in Angola, and another $2 billion, and then $500 million. The infrastructure gets built, and this is infrastructure not just for doing mining or oil or something like that, but it's schools, it's polytechnic institutes, it's hospitals, it's railroads, it's repaving roads, it's rebuilding bridges, it's setting up irrigation systems, it's doing water systems. There's a huge number of projects. In Angola, they're all listed on the Ministry of Finance's website. That's all in Portuguese, but you can read that if you want to see what exactly they're doing, as I did. So the money never comes into the country, the African country. It stays in Beijing, and it's used to pay the Chinese companies to do this work. Now, it's tied, and that's not probably a good thing. Are the countries getting value for money on these projects? That's a risk. There's no international competitive tenders. That's a problem. They probably cost more. We don't know, but it's quite possible. And And there are other possible risks as well, kickbacks I mentioned earlier. But as one African official said to me, with China, you never see that money. And so these ideas that we have of large sums of cash going into African governments that they can then draw on and without any accountability are not the case, actually. So in the West, we've been importing oil from Angola for a long time. And we haven't been giving much aid to Angola because it was a government that we didn't really care much for. The MPLA. We were supporting, in the United States, we supported UNITA, which was fighting against the MPLA. And so, but we continued to import oil. It was an interesting relationship. We had Western companies pumping the oil in Angola, and we imported it, and then we paid the government that we were also helping the rebels that were fighting against the government. So we paid for the oil, and it went back into Angola, and there was it wasn't tied to anything. It got used to fight the war. It went off to Swiss bank accounts. Who knows what happened to it? But at least with the Chinese, this locking some of these natural resource exports into infrastructure up front guarantees that you can overcome, even in a small and modest way, some of the natural resource curse that many of these small resource or large resource-rich countries are subject to. So I'm going to conclude now, but I want to say three things in conclusion. Chinese aid and engagement in Africa is very different from ours in the West. And it's different for three reasons. First of all, China's core ideas about development are different than ours are. They are far less prescriptive than we are. We in the West think we know what Africa needs to do to develop. But many of our ideas and our certainties change every few years. The Chinese are much more simple about this. At home, they say, to get rich, build a road. They say agriculture is the foundation, industry is the leading edge. And so that's what they go into in their aid. They go into infrastructure, roads, they go into agriculture, and they've been fostering manufacturing. And these are things that African governments and African people have been interested in getting. Second, China's experience as a recipient of aid and loans, particularly from Japan, influenced their thinking about how countries should give aid and how they can use aid and other forms of economic engagement for mutual benefit. And they don't see this as problematic, that it should be about mutual benefit. They're very upfront about it. And we tend to hide it. There used to be, on the USAID website, there used to be information about how much of every dollar from American aid came back to America and how much we were building up countries to foster American exports. That's been removed now. But people used to attack USAID, and they've learned that they can't talk about aid like that. But that is how aid is often thought of on the Hill in Washington. And finally, China is becoming an East Asian developmental state, like Japan, like Korea, like Taiwan. And we know what this looks like. State intervention to promote economic prosperity, mostly at home. But we just haven't seen a country working like this in Africa on this scale. So the book is a window into a changing world. It's a topic that I think has a lot of importance for Africa, and the fact that so many people are here suggests that you might agree. And for those who care about development. And we can see China's rise as a threat. And in many ways, there are a lot of things associated with it that are threatening. There's more competition for African industries. There's less regard for the environment, lower social standards, safety standards on Chinese companies. And it's neutral at best for governance. It isn't doing anything to make governance improve, at least not in the short term. Or we can see it as an opportunity. African countries are getting the infrastructure that they need so badly. They're getting investment in manufacturing, which we're not doing, and business engagement across the continent. But first, and most importantly, we do need to understand it better. It's time to revise and move beyond the conventional wisdom. And this will help us to engage more effectively with the Chinese in the West, and I hope with Africans as well. That's why I wrote the book, and I hope you'll read it. Thank you. So I guess I'm fielding the questions, which is fine with me. Yes?
Knowing that U.S. policies would antagonize China, why did we sell arms to Taiwan, and then why are we inviting the Dalai Lama here to do this?
Well, that's not quite on topic, but I'll answer it anyway. Because we have a strong belief that our core interests are not only served by doing what China feels are in its core interests. When we switched relations from Taipei, which we had until the end of 1978, we recognized Taiwan as China and switched it over to Beijing. We developed legislation on the Hill, the Taiwan Relations Act. And in that act, we guaranteed Taiwan's defense, and so that we would continue to supply arms to them. And so it's required by our legislation that we supply them with arms, and that has never changed. So we're actually legally required to contribute to their defense. And I think the policy of the government has always been in support of that, because I think our government wants a peaceful solution to the civil war, which is still ongoing. They want peaceful reunification, but the time is not yet ripe for that. And I think that the government in Taiwan also is not proposing independence. So they also want peaceful reunification. At least that's the KMT, the Kuomintang policy on that. Now, what about meeting with the Dalai Lama? Well, why shouldn't our leader meet with the Dalai Lama? The Dalai Lama is a spiritual leader. He's a leader in exile of a large population. And I was disappointed, actually, that he didn't meet with the Dalai Lama. I can understand that in Beijing they feel this is interference in China's internal affairs. They feel this very strongly. They really sanctioned the French for meeting with the Dalai Lama when Sarkozy met with him. So I can understand Beijing's perspective on it also. But we have our interest in supporting human rights and supporting someone who's been a peaceful leader for that population. And then Beijing has its interest in making sure that Tibet remains part of China, which I think most people agree that it is. So I think meeting with I went to see the Dalai Lama when he came to Washington. So I think, and that's the second time I've seen him, I think he's an amazing person. So I'm glad Obama's had a chance to meet him. Yes?
Since I also work on China and Africa, but only in one country, Tanzania, I have to agree. I agree with everything you say on this topic. However, I think there's one dimension which hasn't been touched on enough, and that's the social impact of Chinese coming into Africa. And I can tell a very short story. Last September, when I was going to Kayako in Dar es Salaam, there was a fight between one Chinese and one African, and they fought, and at the end, the African stood up and left, but before he left, he said, "Why did you come here? Why did you leave China? Just come here and sell roasted peanuts." So this is an issue that I've noticed a lot in Tanzania. There are a lot of poor Chinese who come into the country, and there's a lot of anxiety. So this is a shifting paradigm in Tanzania. Since they haven't had any xenophobic attacks in the past, and I hope there's not going to be any in the future. So then the question is, under what condition can the partnership between an African country and China be beneficial to the people?
That's a really good question. I actually discussed this not the fight, but I discussed the Chinese traders selling peanuts at Karyaku in the book. And also they're allegedly selling flowers on the sidewalk, although I went to Karyaku when I was in Dar es Salaam, and I didn't actually see any of that. So I looked to find them selling flowers. So that day that I was in Karyaku, they weren't. but I'm sure at other points they were, because I saw a lot of Chinese traders in Karyaku with their stalls. They were all over, and then pulling the hand carts around. Karyaku is a small, large, crowded market in Dar es Salaam. This is it's a good question, and it's fundamental. I do address these issues in the book because this cultural clash, this rapid expansion of Chinese people in Africa is a problem for the Chinese, and it's perceived as a problem, I think, in most African countries. Well, what are all these people doing here now? We don't have good numbers on how many Chinese have gone to Africa. We do know that in 2008 there were 140,000 Chinese workers officially in Africa. And the number of Chinese workers is going to be beyond that, because those are the number that are reported by the Ministry of Commerce. And every country you go to, it's a phenomenon that's quite visible now in the streets. Now, there are a couple ways to look at this. On the one hand, Chinese traders and African traders who are going to China to buy goods are getting low-cost goods that are enabling a lot of Africans to purchase things that they never were able to purchase before. And in terms of the quality of many of these low-cost goods, it's not very high. But as someone said to me in Zambia, they said you can go to Kamwala, which is the Kariakou of Zambia, the Kamwala market, and you can buy something there from a Chinese shop, and it might break after a day or two. But then you can go to Game, which is a big department store, and you can buy something from China in Game, and it will actually last because it's a lot more expensive. So they recognize that you have to pay more for better quality. But in terms of the ethnic tensions between the people there, I predict that they're going to increase. And it's because there's going to be a continued expansion of Chinese in African markets, and it's for all the same reasons that you've described. There are people who have come over as workers and they're going to stay, or they've been imported by Chinese business networks through family connections to work for them, and then traditionally when they've saved up enough money, they'll go and start their own little business. And so sometimes saving up enough money is like when you're not working for your Chinese relative, you're there on the sidewalk selling peanuts, and you're saving money however you can to get your own business going. So that's a kind of cultural trait which is going to continue to find more and more Chinese there. And I think it helps to understand that there are Chinese diasporas all over the world, and some of them are very old. You have a Chinatown here in Chicago, and of course we do in Washington, New York, and all around the United States we have Chinatowns from Chinese diasporas in the past. And what happened in 1949 when the PRC was founded is that the borders were closed and the Chinese stayed home. And so there's this pent-up diaspora, essentially, that wasn't even able to come out for decades and decades. And so in part what you're seeing is kind of an explosion of this, and people are moving out at a much faster rate, and they're coming to Africa, where they hadn't come in great numbers in the past. There's some exceptions, but they hadn't come in great numbers in the past. One last thing on that, which is that if these Chinese citizens, if they stay, and if they form their businesses, what we found is that they very quickly move out of those low-level kinds of things. So they move up, they buy little shops, they move into bigger shops, and then they start becoming the wholesalers and then selling to the retailers. And they might be selling to African retailers or new Chinese retailers or both. And some of the interesting research that's been done on this, there's a woman, Nina Silvanas, who's just finished her PhD at UCLA in part on this. And she's monitored Chinese traders in the textile industry. I think it's in Benin. And she's shown how this has changed just over the past 5 years. You've seen transition up to the higher levels of the chain of command in the markets. And I think that's a phenomenon we'll see as well. Yes?
This might be a simple question. What kind of languages do the Chinese speak when they visit in Africa?
Well, it depends how long they've been there. When they first come, most people don't speak a local language. They often will speak some English or pick up some French. But once they're there for a little while, then they learn the local colonial language usually, or Swahili. So these peanut sellers in Kariakou they're calling out in Swahili to get people to come and buy peanuts. So it's they pick up local languages, and I mean, this is a broad generalization, but it's clear that the first companies that come and the first Chinese that arrive don't usually speak the local language, and they have translators. But then after a while, they do learn the local languages.
Is there a support system there that schools, hospitals?
Not very much. In some countries, I believe actually in Tanzania, they either have set up a Chinese school or they're setting up a Chinese school. But interestingly, one of these special economic zones that the Chinese are setting up in Africa is going to be in Mauritius. It's already being constructed in Mauritius. And this is going to be much more service-based than manufacturing. And one of the things they want to do there is set up a Chinese boarding school so that people that have their families in the mainland of Africa can send their kids to Mauritius for boarding school and then not have to send them all the way back to China. There's also another interesting thing that I learned, which is that Chinese that are working in Africa, I think for a period of 2 years, can have more than one child without penalty. Yes?
I'm interested in your take on China and Ethiopia, which is my area of specialty. What I can attest is that for a variety of reasons, they have aroused a great deal of negative response in Ethiopia. They have been huge leases of land, pushing aside indigenous farmers, and they have quite a few of them have operated businesses in violation of local laws. They have been taken to court by the city. Ethiopians generally are sensitive about foreign interventions, and they have a term fringe, which is pejorative, which they've used for 1,000 years, derived from Franks. And now, instead of calling foreigners fringe, they now say China.
Very vague.
Well, quite a few people say that. For example,
To non-Chinese.
to non-Chinese, yes. What else? They have been accused of going to markets early in the morning, buying up food and shipping it to China before the locals have opportunity. I don't know how valid that is.
I doubt that.
I rather doubt it too, but what I'm talking about is a growing sense of discomfort. I want to mention one or two more. One is the Ethiopia is under a very repressive political regime right now, and the diaspora and also Ethiopians at home use the Chinese presence in enforcing and supporting that kind of impression. So I'd be interested in.
Those are interesting observations. I haven't been to Ethiopia, so what I know about Ethiopia is based just on digging into various stories. My research assistant went to Ethiopia for me, and we looked into some of these stories. We particularly were looking at the special economic zone, which is being set up in Ethiopia. So that's, and there are manufacturing ventures that Chinese companies are doing. They're actually quite interested in Ethiopia. I'm not exactly sure why, because the foreign exchange regime is quite problematic there. But Ethiopia is the one case where I've also heard rumors about these land grabs, and I haven't been able to track down the realities of that. So that's, I would, if you have evidence about that, I would just love to have that, because I haven't been able to find it. And I have heard stories about it as well. So in terms of the Chinese are very engaged in the construction industry in Ethiopia. They've also got a huge telecommunications project there. The Millennium Telecommunications Project is $1.5 billion. And then the infrastructure projects, there's a line of credit for at least $500 million and probably more there. So there's a lot of engagement in Ethiopia. It's along the lines, again, because I haven't been there, I can't speak personally about this, but I could understand. In many countries, people are very, they're unhappy with Chinese business practices because, as I mentioned, they aren't at the standard that people have come to expect from foreign investors. In many instances, they're more similar to some of the local business practices, and in many instances, they can be worse. Safety standards, as I said, and labor relations have been problematic across the continent.
What I would like to report is, and this is quite firmly supported, that the Chinese have installed state-of-the-art monitoring internet, email, surveillance, and that is widely understood to be Chinese and scary. And I will now no longer send straight to second thing that is widely disapproved now, and I'm surprised, that over the years the roads have been fantastic. But now I hear that the quality of the road construction is so poor, the taxi drivers now generally curse the Chinese because they've been building roads that crumble after a year. I don't know, but that's hearsay. Pretty widespread.
Okay, on those 2 points, that's interesting. They say the same thing in Zimbabwe about the internet monitoring equipment, and it's quite possible. I mean, they have it in China, so it would probably be something they'd be willing to export if a government wanted it. So I find that quite plausible. I have no evidence about it either, but I do know that people also make that case in Zimbabwe. In terms of the road quality, these anecdotes that one hears, I've also heard anecdotes about road quality being poor, and I've also heard anecdotes about road quality being good. So it's really hard to have any systematic picture of this. I know that since Chinese companies are winning these contracts, I would expect that they would have a track record, and if road quality was deteriorated after 1 year in the projects they had done in the past, then they wouldn't, most likely, under a competitive bidding situation, they wouldn't be getting contracts again, certainly not with international donors who would look at that track record. So I imagine there are mechanisms to weed out the poor quality and tend to expand the better quality construction firms. And I know the Chinese government is very concerned about the quality of the construction, particularly if it's an aid project, because this reflects aid is done for political reasons, and so it reflects badly on the political relationship. And so they would particularly want that quality to be high if it's an aid-funded project, and they would be able to make sure that that happens, most likely. Other kinds of funding, they may not have the mechanisms to control that. Let's see, someone on this side. Yes?
You talked about the years of pent-up diaspora repression because of the policies of the PRC, but of course during that period there were a lot of Chinese going to Africa from Hong Kong. Taiwan had big development projects of its own, supported by the U.S. That's a different story. And I assume also people from Singapore. Now that there's openness and hope, what is the relationship between the non-PRC, even the pre-Union Hong Kong diaspora, say in Mauritius, and the people coming from the PRC, and particularly people sponsored in some way by the government?
That's interesting. In some countries, as in Mauritius, there were 2 Chinese business associations throughout the post-1949 period. There was the business association that supported Taiwan and the business association that supported the PRC. So, and they didn't get together very often. Today, it's interesting because I actually have a sub-project on Chinese business associations in Africa, and so I did a lot of interviews on that. And I found that the Chinese have set up business associations in in all the countries that I went to, and I think most countries in Africa. This has been supported by the Ministry of Commerce. And what the business associations are supposed to do is to try to help socialize the Chinese businesses, to get them to improve their labor standards, to get them to understand what the local laws are and to obey the local laws. So that's what the business associations are supposed to do with their members. But they can't require that all the Chinese companies join them or follow those laws. And in those business associations, you find Chinese who come from Taiwan, who come from other parts of the diaspora, and Chinese from the PRC. So it's interesting that they tend to find that they have reasons to come together. So that's about all I can say on that, but I think it is interesting. And one more thing, which is that because Taiwan doesn't have diplomatic relations in but 4 countries in Africa, they have only in 4 countries, Chinese ambassadors have said that they are, and ministries of commerce have said that they are there to support Chinese, whether they're from the mainland or from Hong Kong or from Taiwan. That's what they've said. I don't know how much they actually go out of their way to help businesses from Taiwan. Politically, it would be a good move to do that. But that's their sort of official position on it.
Can I ask you, when you analyze Chinese trade policies in Africa or around the world, what does it tell you about what the leadership, the highest leadership of the Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, what are their global ambitions? What does it tell you about what the point of all this is?
Martin Jack. China rules the world. No, I'm just thinking of that because he gave a talk at UCLA when just a few weeks before me. No, it was at University of Southern California. And so everybody was like, Martin Jack. It sounds like Jacques, but I was told that he pronounces it Jack. This is a book, China Rules the World. That's what I've referred to. And he has a theory in there about what China's ambitions are. That's what I was thinking when you answered that question. I don't know what the Communist Party's ultimate ambitions are. I can only say what they have, what the State Council and the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, which is China's sort of what's left of the planning ministries, what they have said about their engagement in Africa and worldwide in general, that they want to promote a peaceful, prosperous world so that they can basically do business and develop at home. So that the more they can do, that they can trade, they can get people to buy their goods, the more that they can invest overseas. They have a whole policy called, it's been accelerated in the last decade, called going global or walking out. And that's about getting Chinese companies to become big multinationals. It's really following in the footsteps of Japan. So if we look at Japan in the 1970s and 80s, I think we can learn a lot about what China's doing today. In terms of their global ambitions.
Why is China?
I'm not sure. Did you get another question?
Well, it's a very brief.
Okay.
Why is it that China, in the fall, you made the comment or the analogy about the Japanese movie, Kurosawa's movie about Russia, in which you have an event and you look at it from different points of view, and from everybody's point of view, it can all be interpreted in a different way. But when the Zhangzhui, I believe that's their name, in Darfur, go into villages and rape and pillage and murder, you could have 1,000 cameras set up, you could have 4 cameras set up. It all looks the same. There's only one interpretation of what's happened. The Chinese are quite aware, being there. Their diplomats are there. Their trade representatives are there. I'm sure they have people who are sending them correspondence to the highest levels of the Chinese government about what has occurred day after day, month after month, year after year. And yet only when there's blowback, when there's bad publicity, do they do anything about it.
I think in order to understand this, one way to look at it is to say that they're just out there for their cold self-interest, and they will resist anything that gets in the way of money or profit. And that's one interpretation. Another way of looking at it would be that they have this very long-standing foreign policy principle, which is not to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And this is, as I say in the book, this is very convenient for Chinese businesses to have this kind of foreign policy as well. And I also would just, because you said this would be a short question, I would raise the counterfactual. What would a world look like in which the Chinese government regularly did intervene in the internal affairs of other countries? We know a little bit, because our government does this regularly. You know, we actually invade other countries. And it's, you know, I'm given 2 choices about how to act in the world. I certainly wish they were far more advocates of good governance and democracy. I would like to see that. I don't think we are going to see that, though. Yeah. Can I just take another question? Let me see. In the back there.
Yeah, there's a big debate about the role of foreign aid and development in African countries. In your experience, can you comment on the China model versus, Western governments going the foreign aid route versus China investing in business, and which do you think is more effective or cost benefit?
I think the jury's still out on the Chinese route. all we can do, again, we can look at how Japan engaged with this same model, and they engaged in China and across Southeast Asia. And I think there's a lot of evidence that this thing about promoting Japanese business and infrastructure contracts and Japanese investment and tying aid to all of that was actually beneficial for Southeast Asia. After all, we had an economic miracle in that part of the world. So we don't yet have evidence enough to know how China's, this is very recent, how it's going to work on their part. What we know about aid from the West in Africa is that many African countries are poorer now than, or as poor as they were at independence, and others are not. But and they've been getting aid all of that time. So that's not to say that it's a direct relationship, but it hasn't been a relationship that's really raised Africa out of poverty, and that's huge. These are many. You can spend your lifetime working on this topic. And not get the answers as to why that is the case. But I don't think that they certainly haven't cracked the nut about how to develop Africa. We haven't figured out how to do that in the West. Let me turn over to this side in the back. The AGOA agreement is a trade agreement that we have. It's one of preferences for African countries. And they are allowed to bring manufactured goods and a lot of other goods into the United States without duty, so duty-free. And what this did was it's created incentives for investment in Africa. United States companies didn't do much to invest in manufacturing. It was disappointing from that perspective. But there were Asian companies, and some of them from China, but more of them from Hong Kong, Taiwan, even Malaysia, have come to Africa to take advantage of these preferences and then exporting out. And so what this does is it creates what are in many instances temporary jobs. It does create jobs in industries that are very mobile. And so you find that they become fragile. So these are not really sustainable, robust industrial sectors in the textile industry. AGOA is based on conditionalities. And so if a country doesn't meet certain kinds of requirements, they can have their AGOA preferences removed. For example, if a country has a coup, as they did in Madagascar. And I think this is one of the difficulties of our good intentions. What happened in Madagascar was there was a coup, and the government was overthrown. And so we removed the trade preferences that Madagascar had had. And they had factories there that were exporting to America, and there were something like 100,000 people working in those factories, and they were immediately put out of work. Or at least this is what I've read on Bill Easterly's website, AidWatch, in which he criticized this. So I haven't looked into this myself to find out that it's true, but I think Bill Easterly's probably pretty reliable on that. So it's an unfortunate side effect of our commitment to better governance that it has this result for all of these workers who lost their jobs as a result of that.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
I just have a question about the land use you were talking about. And it may be a bad question, but I'm just wondering why companies like ZTE want this land.
You know, I wondered this myself, and I've tried to find this out. I haven't been able to find out. I suspect that it may have something to do there. ZTE has a lot of telecommunications projects in the DRC, and so this could be a kind of a security or a financing mechanism, a swap of some kind, in order to secure these loans or these investments. ZTE, the telecommunications company that has this 100,000 hectares in the DRC to grow oil palm, which they aren't yet doing, but they have. It's been allocated to them. And he asked why. Why are they doing that? And I don't know either. But I think it's certainly an interesting thing for someone to do research on this coming summer. All right. So who is it? Gosh. I can answer some questions afterwards. So in the back.
Have you come across instances where conflict is there's conflict developed between neighboring countries when the Chinese are putting their infrastructures in place, especially in water, where a river is going and they have to do something to use it for industry, and the neighboring country is not a part of this venture.
I actually haven't seen anything like that. That was quick. Sorry. Okay.
Well, thank you, Deborah.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.